For those of you out of the loop of the Irish news cycle, 2022 was a year with two very significant demographic milestones for both nations on the island of Ireland. The first being, the Republic of Ireland's population this year rose above 5 million. Similarly, Northern Ireland's population has grown to over 1.9 million people, meaning that altogether the number of people living on the island of Ireland numbers over 7 million people for the first time since 1845. Astonishingly, this number is still a million people fewer than that were living in Ireland in 1844. It's important to note that the census of 1841 includes the population of the entire island of Ireland, when both Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic were a single nation within the United Kingdom. The second important milestone is that there are now more Catholics living in Northern Ireland than there are Protestants. If the significance of this particular milestone is unknown to you, understand that a large part of Ireland's history that has defined the separate directions both nations have taken up till now is owed in strong part to the delineation of a Protestant Irish North and a Catholic Irish South. But there is a different side to the story everyone knows about the island that never was. It encompasses the island of Ireland and the two separate countries that exist on it. This is not, however, the story of two islands that you think it is. Not about the two different nations of Ireland. Well, it is, but it is also a story about the island that could have been, and the island that is. The island that endured a famine, war, rebellion, recessions, and disease. The British Isles includes all the islands you see on this screen. The name of the archipelago itself is disputed, as the Irish government refuses to accept the term, given it implies there being something British about the island of Ireland. I will be referring to the whole region as the British Isles, for the purposes of this video, for simplicity's sake, not because of particular political leanings. Great Britain is obviously the largest island, and is home to England, Scotland, and Wales. Ireland is home to a country named the Republic of Ireland, and also Northern Ireland, which is separate from the Republic and is part of the United Kingdom, and occupies the northwest quarter of the island. And actually, I'm going to have to stop right here, and apologise for the number of times I'm going to be saying either Ireland or island here. It's just that this story is about the different islands. Great Britain is the largest island in the British Isles, and is not actually a country in of itself. The United Kingdom is the official name of the nation that is composed of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and is the country most people casually think of as Britain or even England, even though these are regions and constituent countries, respectively, contained within the sovereign nation of Great Britain. England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland are each referred to as countries, but they are not sovereign states as, say, France, Japan, or Australia are. For simplicity's sake, think of them as akin to US states, being separate political entities within a larger union, possessing their own devolved governments and elected bodies, except for England. Ireland is an island, and the Republic of Ireland is a sovereign nation occupying roughly 85% of the island of Ireland. Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom, called a country but is not a sovereign nation in its own right. It occupies the remaining 15% of Ireland. Anyway, geography, politics, and history have shaped the British Isles in unique ways. Looking at a simple topographic map, it is easy to see where you would choose to settle in a game of civilization. The large fertile plains of southern Great Britain, only interrupted by gently rolling hills, are prime real estate. And central southern England has for more than 1,000 years been the population centre of the British Isles. Scotland, Wales, and northern England consist of smaller plains, interrupted by relatively low, but steep and infertile mountain ranges, covering the majority of the rest of Great Britain. Thus, this makes control by a centralised government, and large-scale agricultural production, challenging in these regions. It is for this reason the Romans failed to establish control over the Scottish Highlands, and decided it was easier to build a 73-mile-long border wall to keep the wildlings, Pictish tribes, out of civilized lands. Let's move over to Ireland now, and a similar story is played out. Northern and Southern Ireland are dominated by relatively small but infertile mountains with steep sides, with Central Ireland being a broad, flat plain filled with ample water and fertile soil to grow food en masse. An additional smaller plain exists in the north and is mostly filled by Lough Neagh, which is the largest lake in the British Isles. Similar to Scotland, the geography of steep, low-lying mountains across the southern, western and northern extremities, creates the perfect conditions for isolated, close-knit clan structures to develop. Clans which are difficult to establish rule over, having their own customs and traditions and laws. Thus this makes centralized control of the entire island difficult, again like Scotland. Even today there are stark contrasts in spoken language between these mountainous extremities, where Irish is still spoken regularly, and the Central Plain, where English is overwhelmingly dominant. Map after map demonstrates the differences between the Central Plains of the Republic of Ireland and mountainous coastal extremities that exist even today. Two islands, one roughly 2.5 times the size of the other. They both have similar geographies and a theoretical capacity to support large populations. So logically, Ireland would have a population that is roughly 2.5 times smaller than Great Britain's. But of course, this isn't the case. Great Britain is now today home to 65.4 million people, while Ireland, the island, is home to just 8.9 million people. That's little more than a tenth of Great Britain's population. Ireland as a nation is comparable in size to South Korea, a country home to almost 67 million people itself. Now to be fair, the UK is the 9th most densely populated country in Europe, with 270 people per square kilometre. Ireland's population density is only 70 people per square kilometre, which compared to the United Kingdom's is way smaller and lower than the European average. The truly amazing thing is, if you applied Great Britain's population growth curve from 1840 to 2022 to Ireland, Ireland today would have a population of something like 29 to 30 million people. Ireland's GDP today, based on dubious back-of-the-napkin calculations extrapolating Ireland's 2019 GDP per capita, would be $2.3 trillion, which is roughly 2/3 of the United Kingdom's GDP. Ireland, comprising both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, with a population of 29 million and such an enormous economy, would be a major European power, richer than Italy and more populous than Portugal or Sweden. But that's not the reality. That's not what happened, because Ireland and Great Britain's relationship is the story of an abusive relationship. Europe from the 1690s onwards began to emerge out of the endless cycles of religious bloodletting and violence between Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians. The oversimplified version of events is, soon over the next 100 years, a new form of competition grew in the form of nationalism. The competition between emerging nation-states over who would become the most powerful. The kings and queens of the different states were constantly one-upping each other in expansionism in what essentially was an elaborate measuring contest. The Concert of Europe, as it's been called, was one of the drivers for European colonial expansion. A system of confrontation, competition, and one-upmanship that led to Europeans searching for wealth and power further and further afield, away from Europe. The first nations to start it were the Portuguese and the Spanish. They established colonies up and down the New World in what is now modern-day Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Central America, and South America. Through the conquest of civilizations, oppression and exploitation of the natives for resources, and the spread of disease, this caused the deaths of millions in what has been labeled by some as a genocide, and certainly constitutes crimes against humanity. But from this exploitation, Spain and Portugal grew incredibly wealthy, and emerged as major superpowers within the European geopolitical system. Indeed, Spain was wealthier than any other European power by 1700. Similar cases of at best negligence and at worst intentional genocide can be seen within multiple empires over the last 500 years, always for the purpose of profit, more land for their own nations and resources to fuel industry. Notoriously, the Belgian regime of King Leopold in the Congo is an example of a nation run like a workhouse, where men hired to enforce food production often collected severed hands in lieu of sufficient crop yields, or just to terrorize the local population. The Japanese Empire's wars of expansion in the 1930s and 40s provides an excellent showcase for how native populations are exploited by a colonizing force, not as a people, but an expendable workforce, all to benefit the motherland's war effort. What this means is it can be seen that the imperial states pursued three primary objectives when colonizing different peoples and nations: status, wealth, and leverage to improve their own geopolitical positions, all at the negligence of their own paupers, who usually never saw a drop of the profits, and to the suffering of the people they colonized. It is in this backdrop that the Irish and British relationship developed. Ireland had been for centuries evolving on a different path to Great Britain. Unlike its neighbour, it was never colonised by Rome, and it was raided and settled only minimally by Scandinavians such as the Vikings. And it was never colonised and settled by the Angles and the Saxons. Its Celtic culture evolved largely unmolested in comparison to Great Britain, where the mixture of Celtic, Roman, Scandinavian, Saxon, Angle and Norman influences produced an entirely different identity over 1,000 years, especially in the English heartland. When the Norman conquest succeeded in establishing a foothold on Ireland, this began the long bitter history between the two neighbours. The state of England during the Middle Age Plantagenet dynasty became centralised and powerful enough to start looking abroad and become a coloniser of its own, and naturally it looked to its closest neighbours first. Henry II, 101 years after William the Conqueror invaded England, invaded Ireland and became the first in a long line of English kings who attempted to cement control over the entirety of Ireland. Over the centuries, Ireland moved back and forth, between being controlled by independent Gaelic forces to being controlled mostly by the British. At one time, only an area known as the Pale, surrounding Dublin, was controlled by pro-British forces. The most destructive period of war came in the 1600s, the costliest military century in Irish history. Oliver Cromwell, a parliamentarian military dictator and the only non-royal head of state Britain ever had, beheaded Charles I and personally led a campaign of reconquest over the entirety of Ireland, killing over 200,000 civilians in the process. To this day, Cromwell is reviled by the Irish people. Later on, a brief moment of freedom came during the 1798 Irish Rebellion. The First Republic of Ireland was successfully created. 2 years later, with the Act of Union 1800, the two countries willingly unified. The Irish, under the belief they would be treated better this time round, became a constituent country under the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Potatoes did not exist in Europe prior to 1570. It is a root vegetable that is hardier and more reliable a staple food than wheat. It was originally cultivated by the Andean civilizations at least 6,000 years ago, and it could grow in the temperate climates of the Puna grassland in Peru and Bolivia. During European colonization of the Americas, the so-called Columbian Exchange led to a massive transportation of different foodstuffs between the New World and the Old. Tomatoes, chilies, maize, yucca, pineapple, modern strains of strawberries, and potatoes were introduced to European tables and changed modern cuisine across the world. Potatoes were especially useful in places such as Great Britain, Scandinavia, and Ireland. The climate here is less predictable, and not very suitable for reliable harvests of wheat and barley. The potato is more so capable of coping with subpar weather conditions than its competitors, and thus increasing food security dramatically, even for the poor, as anyone could grow them in their garden. Initially, the potato was a complementary food that supplemented other harvests, and eventually overtook other plants to become the staple food of these regions by the early 1800s. This was true in Ireland as in elsewhere, but there were additional factors which enhanced Ireland's vulnerability to the disaster to come. Here are the 4 salient reasons, but not the only reasons, as to why Ireland was so affected. Any biologist will tell you that low genetic diversity in a population of organisms creates the perfect conditions for a disease to wipe out the aforementioned population. In this case, the Irish lumper had no natural immunity to the potato blight, so the disease could spread through and wipe out entire fields with no barriers in the form of immune potato populations to slow the spread. After the Acts of Union 1801, British rule was established over the entire country. Even before the potato famine, the Irish people as a whole were assessed as being close to starving, and ruled by an incredibly weak and unconcerned government. Over 100 Irish MPs sat in Parliament. These representatives, however, were overwhelmingly landowning gentry and their sons, and cared little for the troubles of Irish peasants. The Lord Lieutenant of Ireland at the time of the famine was John William Ponsonby IV, Earl of Bessborough. Not exactly a man with a rich Irish heritage, He was a member of the English Whig Party, and deemed a largely weak and ineffectual ruler by historians, with little influence in Westminster, where all the real power to effect change was concentrated at the time. The ruling class of English and Anglo-Irish aristocrats owned enormous holdings, and whilst renting them out to the poor Catholic majority, used whatever powers they could via contracted middlemen to extract a profit. Indeed, holding land for these aristocrats was primarily profit-motivated, to the extent that the Irish peasants lived in fear of their landlords, and often had to sacrifice their entire income just to remain on their land. This removed any possibility of the majority of peasants being able to purchase food come crop failure. There was no safety net for these people, no personal savings, and during the onset of the famine itself in 1847, an amendment to the British Poor Law, known as the Gregory Clause, brought forward by Sir William Gregory, allowed tenants who owned more than a quarter acre of land to be evicted by their landlords, if they wanted to accept aid, but refused to relinquish ownership of their land back to their landlords. This, of course, resulted in a choice between becoming homeless and starving. With no savings to fall back on, large numbers of Irish people either emigrated or starved to death as a result. The ruling party of the time, the aforementioned Whigs, decided during the early months of the famine that laissez-faire market principles would eventually meet the demands of the starving Irish people, so they adopted a policy of minimal intervention. Of course, over the course of history, it's well known that leaving a starving people to sort out their own food production always ends well. Needless to say, this decision, made early on in the famine by the British government, massively exacerbated the lethality of this disaster. This grossly negligent attitude to the Irish state and the people, displayed by the Westminster Whigs, ultimately exacerbated the effects of an already unprecedented catastrophe into the last Great Famine in all of the Western world. And it is the shadow of this disaster and these men's decisions that in many ways, Ireland and Northern Ireland are only just now stepping out of. This negligent attitude, callously ignoring the suffering of the subjects they claimed the right to rule, is repeated across the course of British imperial history, and resulted in many more catastrophes beside the Great Irish Famine. Well over 1 million people died during the potato famine, and over 1 million people fled the country. This was then followed by a century-long period of population decline as the nation's economy never recovered from this severe collapse. From 8 million people in 1841, the Irish population fell by over 2 million people during the famine to 6.5 million, and then finally stopped falling only in 1931, by which time the population across the entire island was only 4 million people. This constitutes a fall of over 50% during a time in which populations across the globe had been continually rising. Ireland, in contrast to the rest of Europe, had only become poorer and its standard of living worse. In fact, over the same time period where Ireland's population halved and then recovered to a pre-famine population, the world population has increased almost 8-fold. There were cultural and social impacts as well. During the famine, entire villages were abandoned, and only were resettled much later in the 1900s. Ireland was an overwhelmingly rural society, but masses of people fled the starving, desolated countryside to either port cities where food was imported, or to another country altogether. The small Irish hamlets, lacking a church or post office, known as clachans, were abandoned almost in their entirety. These tiny communities were often close-knit, poor, and evolved out of the clan system that had dominated Ireland in the previous centuries. Today, Ireland has a lower urbanization rate by European standards, with 30% of Irish people living in villages or the countryside. However, the rate of urbanization Ireland underwent was much faster than many other countries. This would later benefit Ireland, as it turned out, as it improved education and improved economic output in the later Irish Republic, and the Irish population became more centralised around Cork, Belfast and Dublin. Another effect of this demographic shift is a decline of the Irish language. The west of Ireland, the strongholds of the Irish language throughout history, were hardest hit by the famine, so depopulated faster than other areas of Ireland. These areas are known as Gaeltacht, and are officially recognised by the Irish government as areas of majority Irish speakers, and receive certain protections accordingly. Today, 1.7 million people can speak Irish to an adult level, far lower than some 80% of Irish people in the 1840s. One must stop and wonder at the island that could have been, populous and prosperous, were it not for the famine and British rule. Oh. The famine and the following century of decline stood in stark contrast to the population growth experienced in Great Britain. As previously stated, Ireland and Northern Ireland combined population today would likely exceed 29 million, were it not for this catastrophe. And this sowed the greatest of many seeds of alienation felt by the Irish people for their British rulers, that, decades down the line, would see the end of British rule in Ireland. Come the 1900s, and slowly and surely the tide turned against imperialism. A revitalisation of Irish culture, and the increasing emphasis of the separation between Irish culture and British culture grew stronger and stronger. This was an Irish Renaissance of sorts. The Irish War of Independence between 1919 and 1922 was relatively small in terms of casualties, particularly when compared to Irish wars of the 1600s. However, it cemented the opinion in the halls of Westminster that holding on to the territory of Ireland, which had never turned any considerable profit compared to other colonial holdings, was much more trouble than it was worth. At any rate, this applied to the Catholic majority parts of Ireland. The division of Catholics and Protestants had persisted since the Reformation in England, sparking the spread of Protestantism in the British Isles. Protestantism was somewhat successful in Northern Ireland, but never succeeded in the south, due to a variety of factors, including a failure to communicate the ideas of Protestantism, a deeply entrenched homegrown variety of Irish Catholicism, and the perceptions of the Church of England being just another Anglicisation tool against Irish society. The war was primarily an asymmetric conflict, not a battle of peer militaries. Britain was still at the time a military superpower, even after the bruising conflict of World War I. However, the IRA utilised classic guerrilla tactics, and their popularity in Irish public opinion, which helped to end the war in a military stalemate. After World War I, there was little appetite amongst the British public for another costly, grinding conflict claiming more lives of their young men. The subsequent peace treaty, the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty, created the partition, producing the situation we are all familiar with today. The Republic of Ireland to the south, and Northern Ireland in the north. Still, there were some in Ireland that were unhappy with this arrangement. The liberation of only a part of Ireland, just a single part, was not enough for them. This resulted in a split within the foremost Irish political party of the time. The original Sinn Féin party, into the Sinn Féil, the anti-treaty faction, and the Sinn Gael, the pro-treaty faction. This triggered, following independence, the Irish Civil War of 1922 to 1923. A war few people outside of Ireland are even aware of. This involved fighting between the original IRA and the Irish Provisional Government. The Irish government won, but the war left more scars on Irish society and created the rifts in communities that would hamper the nation for decades to come. The Republic of Ireland was born into poverty, declining population, and a period of immense global crises. The war was still recovering from World War I and the Spanish flu, and the world was steaming towards two crises of even greater magnitude: the Great Depression and World War II. The Republic itself was still suffering, 80 years later, from the effects of the famine on its population, and as a result, its economic output. It was during this period that the Republic of Ireland left the Commonwealth and Empire, and shed the last vestiges of British lordship. However, this did not bring about a positive change. The Irish economy was small and a poor country, more comparable to many Asian and South American nations than a Western European one. Even in the 1980s, Ireland was the poorest country in Western Europe. The combination of steep demographic decline, inherited poverty, and global instability meant that going into the 1950s and 60s, Ireland was drastically poorer than other European countries with especially terrible infrastructure. The situation was not much better north of the border in Northern Ireland, particularly for Catholics. Catholics experienced a situation in Northern Ireland similar to racial discrimination in other countries. The majority of Northern Ireland was made up of Protestants. Catholics were disenfranchised in many ways, including being excluded from almost all government jobs. Local councils, controlled by Protestant unionists, preferentially allocated housing to Protestants. The Special Powers Act allowed the Protestant-dominated constabulary to search houses without a warrant and arrest and imprison any citizen. These powers were used, unsurprisingly, almost exclusively against Catholic nationalist communities. Protestants lived 5 to 10 years longer on average and were wealthier and at less risk of violent crime than their Catholic counterparts in Northern Ireland. This combination of poverty and desperation in the south and Catholic communities in the north was part of the trigger for a renewed period of nationalism in both states, calling for equal rights and the final reunification of the Irish people. This period of revolution, sectarian violence, and terrorism became known as the Troubles. If you lived in England during this period, the word terrorist didn't conjure up some image of extremist jihadists, white supremacists, or communists. No, to most British people, a terrorist was an Irishman, a member of the Irish Republican Army or the IRA. These men were drawn from across Catholic society, and were unified by their nationalism for a united Irish Republic, free of Great Britain. The violence proceeded over the course of 20 years, and by cumulative casualties was the costliest conflict for the United Kingdom since the Second World War. Since 1945, up to 2021, Britain's total war dead in all conflicts numbers approximately 8,000 men and women, both military and civilian. Of this, 2,617 died in the Troubles, or 32% of all of Britain's casualties. It was a brutal guerrilla conflict of sectarian violence that pitted nationalist against unionist, Republican against monarchist, and Catholic against Protestant. It was characterised by the use of increasingly brutal, oppressive force by the Northern Irish and UK governments, and by the bombing of both government and civilian targets in England by the IRA. The conflict was eventually ended by the Good Friday Agreement, increasing proportional representation of Sinn Féin and other nationalist political parties in the Northern Irish Parliament. The agreement also ended the discrimination against Catholics in Northern Ireland, and led to the promise of 50% of all Northern Irish police officers being Catholics, thus ending the discrimination of Catholics by law enforcement. This agreement meant the end of centuries of bloodletting and independence struggles, and established the peace that, mostly, holds up until today. This brings us to how Ireland became the country we're all familiar with today. Ireland made the decision in the 1960s to move away from a protectionist agricultural society with a small but strong industrial sector to integrate more with the global economy. Ireland applied to join the precursor to the EU in 1961, but as we have already discussed, Ireland after the Troubles was still a very poor nation, hampered by a poorly educated population and few white-collar jobs in economics, manufacturing, or the sciences. However, this was all about to change. What laid the foundation for an economic boom was investment. Starting in 1973, Ireland joined the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the European Union, and the Union started pouring large volumes of investment into Ireland's infrastructure. This was initiated the year after Ireland joined the European Union in 1974. With the expansion of the EU from 6 states to 9, an agreement was made, in the form of the European Regional Policy and European Regional Development Fund, to funnel cash from the wealthiest parts of the EU to the poorer regions, and Ireland and southern Italy were by far the poorest of all the regions in the Union at this time. Ireland was also helped by a very strong fertility rate by Western standards. Ireland's birth rate was 3.8 births per person per year in 1980, more than double the European average. Ireland's birth rate did not fall below the natural replacement rate of 2.11 until the mid-90s. This ensured its labour force was young and productive, and capable of capitalising off an abundance of jobs produced from Ireland, opening up its economy to the world. The 90s bore a complete paradigm shift for Ireland, the Irish economic miracle. With the end of the Troubles' worst violence, came the chance for all of that juicy EU investment to pay off. Over the course of 10 to 15 years, the economy boomed, with unemployment rates falling, government tax revenues and infrastructure development skyrocketing, and the country beginning to truly feel like a wealthy Western nation. The investment in schooling the EU had contributed in the previous decades has also paid off, as a new generation of highly educated young Irishmen and women aged in at the right time to provide Irish industry a willing and capable workforce. Starting in 1989, GDP per capita increased substantially, from $15,000 to over $52,000 as of 2021. And in fact, in 2023, it is anticipated that Ireland's GDP per capita will overtake the United Kingdom's. Ireland was hit like a truck by the 2008 financial crisis, and again in 2020 by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it has continued to develop its economy, and is now on a per capita and overall basis doing substantially better than its large neighbour across the sea. Its response to COVID was among the best in the world, with only 1 in 1,000 cases resulting in a death. Today, Ireland is a country benefiting from all the modern luxuries of global integration, and you could argue has scored exceptionally lucky in the game of civilization. It receives plentiful rainfall and has a growing population after a 150-year stint of population decline. It is not, however, a nation devoid of problems. The nation is essentially a tax haven for multinational corporations operating in Europe, and there is significant income inequality between different regions of Ireland, in particularly the aforementioned Gaeltacht, as well as a mounting housing crisis. However, Ireland's biggest headache continues, of course, to be its relationship with its neighbour. Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. Whatever you think about Brexit within the context of the UK, there is no doubt it has soured Anglo-Irish relationships drastically. A core principle of the Good Friday Agreement is the removal of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. When the United Kingdom was part of the European Union and Schengen area, this was pretty easy, as it was part of a massive free trade zone, and a freedom of movement was guaranteed for all the citizens of Ireland's population. Obviously, this is now not the case, and has produced some weird effects after the British Conservative government implemented the new trade deal with the EU. As a result of the Good Friday Agreement stipulations, the Brexit Agreement of 2019 included a protocol, the Northern Ireland Protocol, which creates, in essence, a de facto customs border across the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Yes, you heard that right, a customs border within the borders of a sovereign state. For context, this is a bit like the state of Michigan forming a customs border with the rest of the United States to maintain a free trade zone with Canada. This is a result of the United Kingdom's governments to achieve a trade agreement with the EU that, in their eyes, achieves a complete separation from Europe. But now the UK government, the same elected government that negotiated and signed the deal, has expressed a desire, one that is quite illegal under international law but expressed the desire nonetheless, to unilaterally ditch the protocol. The protocol which is key to maintaining peace achieved by the Good Friday Agreement. This, unsurprisingly, has massively pissed off the United Kingdom's strategic allies, in particular the United States. This reveals Ireland's other biggest strength in this day and age, its cultural weight. As a result of the massive exodus of Irish people to the United States, the US now has a vested interest in maintaining peace in Ireland. And with the US being the United Kingdom's most important ally, this gives Ireland additional diplomatic leverage beyond that which a country of its size should have. This situation has nonetheless led to headaches in both Stormont and the Northern Irish Parliament, Oireachtas, the Republic's parliament. But it has led to opportunity for the Irish nationalists. On one side, should the United Kingdom unilaterally ditch the protocol and drop customs checks across the Irish Sea, then Ireland will be forced to implement what will be in effect a hard border between themselves and Northern Ireland. This will create a prime environment for a resurgence of the sectarian violence from the 70s and 80s, and blood could once again be spilled en masse on Irish soil on both sides of the border. But on the other side, there is a nationalist majority in Stormont for the first time in Northern Irish history. The party Sinn Féin was formed from the peaceful wing of the IRA after the Troubles, and has over time distanced itself from the violence of the Troubles, despite the continuing accusations of harbouring certain men who directly and indirectly supported and participated in the violence. Now Sinn Féin is in power, there is theoretical support for Irish reunification on both sides of the border. And with the British economy doing less well on an overall basis in comparison to the Republic of Ireland, it's easy to make a logical argument for why Northern Irish people would want to join Ireland and therefore the EU again. And here I will speculate that as the current British government pushes harder and harder on the issue of the Northern Irish Protocol, Stormont will be pushed more and more towards a vote for full reunification with Northern Ireland. However, again, this is just speculation for the future. The reunification of Ireland now has significant momentum behind it, and there are good reasons to believe it could happen. There isn't really much the British government, now or in the future, can do to stop it, short of a new Brexit trade agreement which aligns the UK much closer to the EU, and thus removes the need for any hard border. But considering the direction both major political parties appear to be taking, that seems unlikely. Therefore, if I were you, I would keep an eye on this situation in Northern Ireland going into the future. Thank you.
Today's agreement delivers smooth-flowing trade within the whole United Kingdom, protects Northern Ireland's place in our union, and safeguards sovereignty for the people of Northern Ireland.
Of course, the UK strikes a new deal removing customs checks and avoiding a hard border on the very day after I finish editing this video. You might ask whether I think this deal is going to make a difference in the long run for the prospects of Irish reunification. Personally, I don't think so. There is quite a difference between the UK trying to warm up relations with Ireland and the EU again and being a part of the EU, as was the case before 2016. This deal is not going to reverse the demographic and political changes that have occurred within Ireland over the past 6.5 years since the Brexit vote. That makes a united Ireland a more tenable proposition. In my opinion, the changes needed to the political system in the UK to ensure the kingdom as it stands does not break apart are far grander than a single trade deal can encompass. What these changes might look like and what might be needed to prevent the UK fracturing into separate states may be a topic for a future video.